In this video, we'll take a look at one of the leading architectures you can use for creating your projects, be it games or non-game projects within Unity and C#. So I'm going to start by showing a few links. One to the article where we're embedded here, but starting with the main part of my website. All of the Unity materials at /Unity. So that's a table of contents to look at whatever is being added on the subject, including the Unity with Cocktails course, which is about 3 hours so far, or maybe more, of different topics that you can see listed there. You can check that out. And a good introductory article at the top of the page. One of the most recent articles I've done is the game architectures article, where I go into 6 different ways that you could approach architecting a project. By architecting, I mean, how do you decide where the code goes in your project? Do you have small classes that are doing very little things? Do you have very large classes that are handling a lot of responsibilities? And what are the benefits of each of those approaches and the drawbacks? So I've got pros and cons there for 6 different techniques. One of the techniques is called StrangeIoC. If we jump into that link there, we can see something I wrote just recently about one of the asset store items that is a MVCS framework, at least in the implementation that I'm using it. So it really allows you to take advantage of just a few core classes that are provided by the creator and be able to jump right in and set your project up in a very organized way. If you're not familiar with MVC or MVCS, as they call it, down here at the bottom I kind of break down what MVC is. So in a general sense, you were going to break your project code into 4 core areas. And that means when you go to add a new feature, you think, is this data? Okay, that's probably something I need to treat like a model, which is one type of concept in the paradigm. If it's more of a user interface element, that's a view. So if you put a cube out onto the world, that's inherently part of the view. If you're playing a sound or taking input, all of that input-output is view stuff. Controller is where the bulk of your business logic goes, where you say clicking this button should do X or Y. So I go into that there. Services is calling a backend script or loading a offline file or something like that. So you can read that article there. I recommend that, maybe even before continuing with the rest of the video, but I'll go ahead and step through here. So Strange was created here. Here's the website of the creator, and it was inspired by MVC frameworks from other platforms that, other things besides C# and Unity. I think Robot Legs in particular, which is an ActionScript 3 framework available for Flash platform, is cited by the creator as one of the influences. So you can take a look at just the really great documentation there. One of the pieces of documentation they have is the diagram. So let me just show that diagram because I'm going to refer to it again later. So this is created by the authors, and it's quite big, but essentially what we've got is the different areas I mentioned: the model, view, controller, services, and then a couple extra things at the top, which we'll talk about: the root and the context. That's where we're going to start. So let's jump in and look at a code sample that is part of this project itself. I call it the StrangeIoC template. So we'll just open up Unity. And this is the StrangeIoC template, which is available as a free download on that page I just showed. And give it a run. And what I do here is I put some simple UI out using OnGUI, just the basic native GUI within Unity, and have a text field which shows a list of items and then 2 buttons that let you clear out those items and load in those items. So reviewing the full functionality here: clear, load, clear, load. There's not too much to it, but it's loading from a local file that has a list of PlayStation Vita games, just for some sample data there. You can also see the console output on the right, which if I clear and clear the console and hit load one time, it's going to show a numbered order of traces which I chose to put into the project, and I talk about it in the article, so that if you're new to MVC as a paradigm, you're able to follow through these steps 1 through 7. So where is that project available for us? Well, if we go back to the main website, you can see we can download a zip file, which is going to be the C# files. You can get it from the asset store, which is what I've done, the Unity store, or you can get it on GitHub and either pull it down from Git or get the zip from there. So I've already taken care of that for us. Went to the asset store, looked for StrangeIoC, and then done an import, and it pops up. And what that's going to do is it's going to put a StrangeIoC folder into your main assets root. I've dragged it into a different folder here just for my own use. And within it, it'll have some scripts, then it has some extra stuff, I think, in an examples folder that I've stripped out. So if you come right in and just use what I've got here, it's going to really just contain the core scripts classes that would be reused project to project. And the only example per se is my example built on top of it. So if I sort the project by scripts, by scenes, and just load that scene up, that's where you'd want to start. Just go to scenes, there's only one scene in the project, and then that's going to get us the build that we've got here. So taking a little look at what we've got on the screen. There's the camera, of course, the white instructions text, which isn't really part of the MVC, so to speak. It's just set up there extra, just reminding you that there's not much to this demo. You just click clear and load. And then here's where we start the discussion on Robot Legs itself. StrangeIoC itself. So I created an empty game object, entitled it StrangeIoC template after the project itself. And the main piece of, the main step that you need to do to kick off the whole process is to create a template root class and drag it on there. That's it. Once you do that, you have the capability to start the engine, so to speak, of the MVC. And the MVC is going to handle potentially everything in your project, from taking all of the input to handling all of the graphics and the sound, to doing all of your backend, or depending on your team's philosophy, you might use something like StrangeIoC for just the menus and the metagame that's around all of the games we create on mobile today, like, you know, playing all through all the levels. Then there's the map that takes you from level to level, and then in each level you have a score, and maybe you earn 1, 2, 3 or stars, and then there's connection with many social services like Facebook, etc. So all of that could be handled with this, and then maybe your core game, for whatever reason, is outside of that. Some people don't want to use an MVC framework for their game logic itself, but for me, it's a viable option. So this whole demo is done with the MVC. So let's look at the code. I'm actually going to open up that root, but I'll open it up in MonoDevelop, so give that a sec. I'm going to expand some folders here and just talk about the project organization. There's no requirement in using Strange to organize your folders in a certain way, nor is there a requirement to use namespaces, but I've done both. So I'll talk about both of them here. Actually, maybe just be simplest if I shut down here. So in my custom folder for this project, I've got a scripts. Inside scripts, I've got a folder for this project. Then I choose to create an MVCS, a model view controller and service folder. And within that, I have subfolders of each of those names. And then the two main files sit outside. So let's start with those two main files, and then I'll dig in. So the root is what is going to kick off the process. It's what's going to actually create the context itself. So you can think of the context as the bubble in which this MVC lives. things that are not part of that bubble. Like I said, if you wanted to have part of your overall project be outside of the framework, that's very possible. But everything that I'm doing here, I'm passing in an instance of the game object itself that's on the stage as this, and then the next parameters and the next method just kick off the process. And it's important that you extend context view. So this is the actual view or the graphics, because it's a game object on the screen. Then if we jump into the context, we can see that that extends a built-in class that I did not create, which is the context, or the the bubble, the sphere of influence that is this particular project. That's where you're going to do certain setups, like all of the bindings is the main area you're going to work with. So let me see if I can put a little bit more of that on screen. So the documentation gets into exactly what this does, but you can see with my comments I've broken it down again into model, view, controller, and services. And what you do in each case is you're creating these injectable classes that you can reuse throughout the project, or rather you can reference them throughout the project. So in a traditional OO project, you need to have a specific reference to something and able to use it. So if you have a local variable called x, then in the next function you can't get at that. But if you move x to being a private property or public property, then you can call that public property through each of the methods in a given class. This is generally what you refer to as scope. If I want that x to be accessible outside, it needs to be public, and then that second class needs to have a reference to the first, etc. So there's a concept that something is only as accessible as it needs to be. You kind of break those rules by controllably choosing which classes, which references to which classes you want to be accessible anywhere. So anywhere has an asterisk after it because there's a little bit of rules to it. But you can think of it being somewhere between the typical OO structure and on the other end of the spectrum being like globals that are accessible anywhere. So it's not quite as free as the globals, and it's not nearly as restrictive as the original pattern. But what you're doing here, maybe I'll talk about the service as a particular example. So I want to be able to get at the service class. The service class, if we jump into it, is what's going to handle calling to, it's going to load the game list. So the code that you see here is going to load in text from a local text file. So I found this example somewhere online. I can't explain it too much better than what you see here, but essentially what you're doing is grabbing a asset from a resources folder within this project, parsing through it, and it just has a list of PS Vita games, and it's building a list, generic list by string, and then it's passing that on. So where the class that needs to call load is going to need access to the custom service class. So in a typical sense, you'd think, okay, well that class, somewhere else in code is going to say something like, custom service C equals new custom service, and then do load game list, something like that. We're used to creating a reference, be it local or something like C here, or creating a property out of C, and really handling things that way. Where we're going to see the power of the StrangeIoC is that it's going to give us not only the MVC framework itself, which we're working within here, but this concept of binding and injections. So jumping back, so let's keep this in mind. Okay, we don't need to individually create our custom service. Instead, we call this line here. And there's quite an elegant language and lexicon here. It looks very human readable. The injection binder, which is saying make this accessible in a lot of places. Bind together a a class of custom service and make it accessible like a singleton. So no matter how, I didn't do anything special to make it a singleton. I didn't declare the constructor private or anything that you would do. It's just a regular class with a public constructor. But this language here that's in this line is telling us that no matter how many classes try to access custom service throughout the lifetime of this application, it's going to give us just the very same instance that was created first, which is really cool. Again, the documentation gets into that. So let's look at where I actually use that. And there's a command that is load button click. Yeah. So when the load button is clicked, there's a series of events that are executed, or a series of things that happen. And inside one of those steps, the load button click command is executed. And what that's doing is it's calling the iService do load game list. Now, it's doing something like this that we had from before, something in a more traditional sense. But we want the flexibility to be able to access that service from anywhere, and we want to be able to treat it like a singleton selectively. There's language we could have used in that syntax we saw earlier to have it behave differently, but in this case a singleton is cool. Anytime I want to get at that same script, I'm fine to be reusing the same service class instance. So how does this actually appear in here? Well, what StrangeIoC is named for is the inversion of control. And that's saying that instead of someone having passed me, let's say, an instance of, well, I guess iService, like that, and then being able to use it, that's the typical control flow. Something from outside of this scope sends down an argument that we're able to access. That's not what's happening here. It's actually up here, declared as a public property. And the magic of it all is this inject attribute. By using the inject attribute, the framework is going to automatically say, go get me an instance of iService under whatever rules that we've already seen in the mapping, or we don't really care about the details. Maybe it's going to be a singleton, maybe it's going to be a multiton or whatever. Maybe it's going to be a fresh instance every time. And you don't know that from this context, but those rules that we saw before in the template context is what's telling it. So any class that's living within the MVCS world is able to do that, and it's going to get that same instance. So it's really like having instant access, and we're getting that access from the bottom up, and that's the inversion of control. Instead of having to be passed the instance from outside in a traditional sense, like through a constructor or through a method parameter, we're able to get right at it here. So let me see there. We'll jump back to the context, see if there's something else. So something similar is happening with the commands. Something similar is happening with the way the view's set up. Same with the model. We've got one model, one service, and then a couple of things related to the view, and the controller is quite bulky there with 5 or 6 things. So I'm not going to get into details of that, but I just wanted to embed this video into the article itself to help you kind of familiarize yourself with where to be looking for the code. So that's the last thing I'll look at here. So all of that stuff that we talked about in the binding, everything that we see mentioned there, also exists here in the treed out view. Now you might ask, if I look at the world, we don't see anything other than the white line of instructions in this template root, so how do we actually get these graphics out on the screen? Well, you can definitely manually place graphics or 3D objects, whatever you want to call them, view items, into the world in the very traditional way you'd always have been. And then you can wire them up pretty quickly to have them just be recognized inside the context or the sphere of influence or the bubble of the MVC. That's possible. An alternative is to attach them dynamically. And so what I've done here in the, I think it's in the startup command, is I've just run a few lines there that's going to create a new game object. It's going to parent it to the same root that we had on that stage, and I'll show this part in just one second. And it's going to put on the custom view UI. Now, custom view UI is just a regular class, mono behavior, and what it's going to do is on its on GUI, it's going to render the on GUI panel and the on GUI text field and the buttons and stuff like that in a very typical fashion. There's nothing really rendered to the screen that is unique to StrangeIoC. That's just boilerplate work that Unity can do. But it's all of these interactions between the commands and stuff that's the MVC. So the last thing I'll show is how once we play, we've got, you can see the custom view pops up here. Okay, so that's it. I think the last thing I wanted to show was just going to one video, I'm sorry, to one web page, not video, here at the StrangeIoC, and just point over to just how great the docs are. First of all, they're really well written. They're very comprehensive. My project uses what's called signals, and I talk about this in the article. There's an alternative that is always going to be an alternative, and it's using events that are part of the StrangeIoC. So you can choose signals or events or both, and that's the way that you're communicating between the different M and the V and the C and the S. I'm choosing to use signals. But the documentation only really talks about events, so it might be a bit confusing if you're coming in thinking about signals and the documentation talks a lot about events. But other than that, the sections are very clear, and the one thing I wanted to point out was viewing the project on GitHub. And then down here, there's kind of a welcome to it as well. And then the feature request and bug report is a great link to look at. Also, if you are coming from Robot Legs, I mentioned in the article that there's a welcome section that's specifically for you. So Robot Legs is very, very close to this. I mean, you'll pick it up in 2 seconds if you're coming from the Robot Legs world. Most of the similarities from Robot Legs that you see, are the welcome ones, and then there's a couple things that are C# specific that are throughout the way that Strange works. So that's it.